go through tough times, but we bounce back.
I am not worried at this point about the impact on the election. I'm worried about the impact on families, and I'm worried about the impact on our first responders.
It's quite a time for the country. As you know, we're going through trauma in a major part of the country, a kind of trauma you've experienced here in Florida more than once. Please, if you have an extra dollar or two, send them along and keep the people who have been in harm's way, who've been damaged either personally or through their property, keep them in your thoughts and prayers. I've had the chance to speak with some of the governors in the affected areas, and they've talked about a lot of people having hard times.
Welcome back. You know, talk of politics, at least close to home, was literally swept away by Sandy. In the final week of the election, on the East Coast at least, the campaign seemed to, if not take a backseat, all but disappear. So here's what we're going to do for the balance of this hour. We're going to bring you up to date on all you need to know before the election tomorrow. We're going to talk about the impact of Sandy, the final push here by both candidates, the closing arguments, if you will. We'll talk about those key down-ticket races here that could go either way on election eve, and we're also going to make some predictions here at the table, and I'll also tell you why I think one candidate would be better for the next 4 years in this country. So, the storm, it has not been good for America, and politically speaking, it hasn't been good for Mitt Romney. Today, with 1 day left, the president ahead by about ½ point. Now, before the storm hit, Romney ahead by about that much. But I want you to look at the trend lines and how they've changed since Sandy hit on October 30th. Nate Silver, who crunches numbers over at the Times, has the electoral vote going strongly in Obama's favor. So how has Sandy impacted the election? Let's bring in our panel on this. We got Gian-Carlo, Peressutti, former advisor to both Presidents Bush, Jr. and Sr., Dominic, political journalist and author, and our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, who you've already heard of. All right, politically here, let's just talk in terms of not just the optics of it, but whenever there's a natural disaster, a president, and you worked with the last President Bush here on 9/11, when there's a disaster, a president looks presidential just by being in the office. Commanding resources in politics is unseemly if it's injected into the conversation. It lends itself to the Oval Office.
No question about it. And I think it's important to note that the president has the opportunity to look presidential. Whether or not he or she emerges from that crisis with their presidential aura intact is dependent on how they handle it. And I think it's also important to note that in this instance, it wasn't anything that Mitt Romney did or didn't do that put him at a disadvantage. He was at a disadvantage by virtue of the fact that he was the challenger. And when you're the challenger in a presidential race during a natural disaster, there's nothing you can do. Nobody wants to hear you talk about politics because that's not on their mind. So what do you do as a challenger? You have to tread very carefully, and it's not an envious position to be in.
You know, Dominic, in transmission where all the live shots come in, the day, I think it was Wednesday, I'm not sure. But while you saw the president touring the area, you saw on the other live shot in Wisconsin, I think Paul Ryan campaigning and everything else. And even people who aren't as invested in this stuff as the four of us say, oh, that looks bad. And there was that sense. I was even surprised, frankly, the president kept going on the tour, going back into the swing states. I understand why, but I could have almost made a competing argument if he just stayed, I'm dealing with the crisis at hand here, I'm going to put politics in the back burner and work on getting everything that we can expedited. Optically, that might have been better, but in terms of the timing of this, you know, the person who sits in the big chair, it's an innate, as Gian-Carlo said, advantage, right?
Definitely, no doubt about it. And for President Obama, it's an opportunity to remind voters on the eve of the election. And of course, well, before I say anything else, all of our hearts, as you've been saying this week, last week, all of our hearts go out to the people that have been impacted about this, because this is not a game. It's not just about politics. We're talking about people's lives. But with that said, this gave Mr. Obama a chance to remind people that he's the commander-in-chief, that Mitt Romney is the wannabe commander-in-chief, if you want to. And it's just a position where, and I agree with you, where if you're Romney, no matter what you do, you can't win, because the cameras are going to follow the incumbent president. And when you have Governor Christie making comments the way that he did in support of this Democratic president, it's almost sealed the deal on this election.
I would just respond by saying I think the storm has enhanced some of the movement that we saw before the storm hit. I think Romney's momentum had stopped and Obama was gaining ground on Mitt Romney beforehand. And it's not a guaranteed lockdown that the incumbent always gets an advantage in a disaster. And I'll refer you back to 2008, not a natural disaster, but a financial disaster. And it's not like everybody rallied around President Bush. He was not a candidate in that election, obviously, but it sort of lends additional credence to the view that people have already. People thought that, during a disaster that the president is taking action. I know
you're right, Andrew, that it's not a given, but I also know that I'm not sure trending momentum-wise that I necessarily agree. There are a lot of people who agree with you that the momentum, you could start to see the ebb and flow, but I certainly thought the closing weeks going into this, even after 2 strong debates to close out the debate process for the president, that Romney certainly had at least as enthused, if not a more enthusiastic base than Obama.
I think the storm and the reaction to it squelched any chance for him to continue that momentum or resume that momentum, although I would argue that he had sort of lost it already.
I differ a little bit. Romney definitely had momentum, and it could have taken him all the way to the White House. And once this hurricane hit, that was it. End of story. The only thing the American people wanted to hear was from the president and what resources, federal resources, are you bringing to help people.
One comment I'd make about these polls, though, it's really the national number that has moved. It's not the swing state number that has moved very much at all, at least in President Obama's favor, since Hurricane Sandy. So I wonder how much of that movement that you referred to, Andrew, is simply more members of the president's base, more motivated.
Well, we're going to get into all those. We're going to talk about those swing states that you talk about. But there is some legitimate questions about, for people in our area. Listen, to vote here, whatever we think about the candidates, the parties, or anything else, people have died in this country to protect our right to vote. And if you're right now one of those people that used to have a home in Breezy Point, or be one of those people who had a place in the Jersey Shore that literally saw it either go up in flames or wash away, or Lord knows in Staten Island, I can pick a bunch of other locations, but you guys know where I'm saying it. The last thing on your mind right now is voting, because you're just worried about how you're going to stay dry, let alone that you're not going to freeze, and where you're going to get your next meal from. So the question I got more than anything was this weekend, not who's going to win, but are they going to postpone the election? I said, you can't do that. You need a constitutional amendment to the election's happening tomorrow, and I said this weekend on Tuesday, no matter what. Now, 1 million voters in New York and its suburbs, they live in areas where polling places were either damaged, lost power, or are now non-existent. So if you're wondering how voting is going to work tomorrow, you are not alone. And our own Kimberly Wallace, Files Once, joins us with an update on how this is all going to work, and she's going to focus right now on the Garden State. Kimberly?
That's right, Rich. State and city officials are encouraging everyone to get out and vote tomorrow. If you were displaced by Hurricane Sandy and you want to know how you can get your vote in, don't worry, you have options.
They could vote on a provisional ballot, and we will forward that provisional ballot to the county of their residence. They would be able to write in their choices if they know their county or local or state offices on the ballot, write them in, and I'm sure the county would honor that. You can also vote by email or by fax.
7 of the 108 polling sites in Newark remain closed because of power outages.
When the storm hit, there were more than 80% of those sites down. Today, there are 7 that are down that need to be moved.
Well, if you do vote by email or fax, you will only be able to get a federal ballot. Durkin says any information you do need is available at the polling sites. In Newark, Kimberly Wallace, Fios 1 News. Back to you, Rich.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. And to find your polling places in the Garden State, you can text your full address to 877-877 right there on your screen. I mean, desperate times, desperate actions, including here now letting even people vote online here. And I think New Jersey is doing the right thing. Let's go over to New York, where a lot of displaced voters wondering what they do. Well, let's take New York City. You got almost 60 polling places be shifted to entirely different locations. So people think if they go to where they went, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, you're in for a rude awakening. Shuttle transportation on election day is being arranged for residents of some of the hardest hit sections in the city. I'm talking about places like Far Rockaway, Coney Island, obviously Staten Island. Now, if you need info on that here, dial this number, toll-free number, 866-VOTE-NYC. And we've linked these phone numbers to our website. Now, if you live outside the city, and Lord knows if you're in Westchester, you know what I'm talking about here, and you're struggling with power or even points north, and you need info on where you can go to vote or be displaced, there is a toll-free number here, and it might bring up some bad memories, but 1-855-NYS-SANDY. and that'll tell you where you can go. And you want to make a point, Andrew?
I think that this is the best argument that we could have for early voting or for mail voting or any additional forms of voting that we possibly can, because we had a storm a week before Election Day, but what, 85% of the people in our area made their minds up well before that. If people had a chance to cast their ballots early, then you don't wind up with these potential disruptions.
My only thing about that, and we'll get into it, is look in Ohio. You got early voting, and people have been trying to do the rigmaroles. We'll get into that about, keeping some people away. You could have a couple 100,000 uncounted votes here until 2 days after, and if it's within the margin ever, a couple 100,000 votes, which is highly conceivable here, we're not going to know the winner tomorrow night. So there's an upside and a downside to, I think, to add it more and more venues for people to cast their vote, but I hear what you're saying. All right, we take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how each campaign is going to try and seal the deal tomorrow. And literally, it's coming down to Election Day, where they're focusing and also what they're doing. I think it tells us a lot here where they're spending the last 48 hours. We'll be right back.